I'm Colonel Mara Quinn, 41. 20 years in the Army Medical Corps, 15 in the field, 8 on forward lines. I live alone in a government apartment off Fort Barrington, Virginia, where the flagpole cuts the dawn like a bayonet. At the gala, marble floors and chamber strings tried to bleach the dust from our boots. Some wore their uniforms as shields, others as masks. I wear mine as a record. My medals aren't for display, they're for the ones who exhaled after death tried to claim them. When my brother Adrian Cole, ex-Intel turned defense consultant, said, "Quit playing nurse, Mara," the room turned into an interrogation bay. I stayed silent. Because silence, timed correctly, is a lawful order. Before we go any further, I want to know, where in the world are you hearing this from? Share it in the comments, because even if our paths are different, pain and strength sound the same everywhere. The Grand Hall at Fort Barrington felt less like a celebration and more like a tactical exercise. The air, thick with perfume and practiced smiles, hung heavy over the polished marble. Gold banners, lit from below, created a false grandeur. My dress uniform felt stiff, a deliberate contrast to the relaxed evening wear of the other defense contractors and consultants. I could feel the weight of my decorations, not as symbols of achievement, but as proof of a different kind of life. A life spent in the dust and the heat, not under chandeliers. Across the room, my family, the Coles, were a tableau of perfectly rehearsed confidence. Adrian, my brother, was at the center of their orbit. He had a brittle charm, the kind that cracks under pressure but is brilliant in a controlled environment. My mother, Evelyn, had a rehearsed grace, each gesture, each word, chosen for maximum social effect. Our table wasn't a place for family. It was a war room, and I was always assigned to logistics, never command. Adrian's comment, "Quit playing nurse, Mara," was a live round in a quiet room. It was meant to land, to create a subtle shift in the air that everyone would feel, but no one could name. The hum of conversation around us seemed to intensify, a warning hum like a faulty engine. It was a sound I knew well, the precursor to a system failure. My right hand went to the small, unadorned signet ring on my left pinky. A family crest I hadn't looked at in years. I let one of the ribbons on my uniform sit slightly crooked, a small act of defiance. It was a signal to myself, a reminder of battle readiness over ballroom symmetry. My silence wasn't a retreat. It was a precision strike. I watched Adrian and my mother, their smiles fixed as they waited for my reaction, for me to fold, to show the pain. But I had spent too many years in places where the most important thing you could do was nothing at all. I had learned to weaponize stillness. The room was still and quiet for me. But in the corner, I saw him. Lieutenant Rowan Sinclair. He was a combat engineer, IED survivor. His body was stiff, and his gaze was fixed on a point far away. He was the son of General Alden Sinclair, a 4-star whose reputation was as solid as concrete. Rowan was a target-rich environment for Adrian, an opportunity to gain favor with a powerful man. I felt a pang of something deeper than pity. It was recognition. We were both on the outside, in our own ways. I started to move across the floor, the polished marble feeling cold beneath my boots. The hum in the air followed me. It was the same sound I heard right before a chopper took a hard hit. I didn't know what I was going to do. I just knew I had to move. When I reached him, I didn't say anything at first. I just stood at parade rest, a silent sentinel. I could feel the hum in the air around us, the vibrations of a public spectacle being created. I leaned in, just a whisper. "Would you like to dance?" I kept my voice low, for him alone. I didn't lift him. I didn't try to save him. I waited. One shuffle, a breath, another shuffle. He moved. The contact drill was for dignity, not for performance. We moved to the music. And the hum in the air, the sound of the ballroom, shifted. It wasn't a sound of warning anymore. It was a sound of observation. Everyone was watching. I could feel the weight of their gaze, a collective force that tried to push me down. I had felt that force before, in the operating room when a life was on the line. It was a force that could paralyze you if you weren't ready for it. But I was ready. I had been training for this my whole life. I had been taught to stay calm under fire, to not let the chaos in the air affect the mission. The dance was the mission. And the mission was to give Rowan Sinclair his dignity back, even if it was just for a few minutes. As the song ended, General Sinclair's voice broke the protocol. It was a voice that commanded attention, a voice that had ordered men into battle. He said, "Colonel, you just saved my son's life." He said it for everyone to hear. It was a thunderclap in the silent ballroom. Behind me, my family was static, target locked. They had miscalculated. They had expected me to be a casualty of their social war. They had expected me to be defeated by a few words. But they had misread me. I wasn't a casualty. I was a force. And they had just given me a new directive. I just wasn't sure what that directive was yet. But that wasn't the whole story. Before the Grand Hall, before the incident with Rowan, there had been a long, slow accumulation of small cuts. My life, the one I had built outside of the family name, felt like a calm stream. But the water was always being tested, its currents redirected by unseen hands. We had dinner at my parents' house in McLean, Virginia, every Sunday, a ritual that felt less like a meal and more like an operational debrief. The hum of the dishwasher was a constant backdrop, a sound that, to me, was a soothing white noise, but to them, it was just the sound of a chore being completed. My mother would talk about my sister's latest triumph, a new client, a successful pitch, and Adrian would share his insights on defense contracting, always making sure to mention a high-profile name or two. I was the silent partner, the one who listened, the one who supported. I was the one who was just a nurse. This pattern had been ingrained since childhood. I was never a leader. I was always a support asset. When Adrian ran into financial trouble after a failed business venture, it was I who sold my vintage Ford F-150, the one I had restored myself, to cover his bad debt. He told me it was a temporary setback. I told him nothing at all. What was there to say? It was an act of grace. An act of family. But in their eyes, it was an act of subordination. I was a person who provided things, not a person who achieved them. A resource, not a player. They had redlined my name off of project briefs and leadership calls. I was Mara, the sister, the daughter, the one who had an important job but somehow wasn't important. The hum I had heard at the gala, the one that seemed to follow me across the floor, had always been there. I had just been too used to its sound to recognize it as a warning. It was the hum of dismissal, the sound of being systematically diminished. It was the low thrum of a family dynamic that was always working to keep me in my place. Even in the field, it was the same. A few years ago, in Kandahar, my team and I had been under fire. A young private, barely 19, was pinned down behind a crumbling wall. Shrapnel from a mortar round had hit him in the leg. I dragged him out, took a piece of shrapnel myself in my shoulder. I filed the report quietly. I didn't need a medal for it. It was my job. But when I told Adrian about it, he just nodded. "Good thing you were there," he said. The way he said it, it was as if I was a piece of equipment, a tourniquet, a bandage. Not a person who had put her life on the line. I was the one who was always present, always available, always ready to lend a hand. But I was never the one who was celebrated. I was the one who was taken for granted. I had found a kind of peace in that. I didn't need the spotlight. I didn't need the accolades. My work was my reward. But the quiet hum of dismissal had never stopped. It had just been growing louder. An old email from Adrian, tucked away in my archives, came back to me now. He had been concerned about a project I was working on, a medical pilot program. He wrote, "Don't escalate. Stay quiet. We have bigger things to worry about." His doctrine was simple: silence equals subordination. My silence, my discipline, my willingness to be a support asset, they had misread all of it. They had mistaken my quiet strength for weakness, my composure for a lack of ambition, my sacrifice for a willingness to be used. The hum was a constant reminder of how they saw me. And I had let them. I had a recurring dream, one that came to me after particularly long, difficult days in the field. I was standing on a bridge over a wide river. The water was still, a perfect mirror. But I knew, just from the feel of the air, that there was a powerful current underneath. I was always worried that if I took a step, the bridge would crack. That the quiet calm on the surface was an illusion, and the real force was just waiting to swallow me whole. That dream felt more real than ever now. The bridge was my life, the calm on the surface, the illusion of peace. I had always been afraid of it cracking. I had always been afraid of what was underneath. And now I was starting to realize that the hum I was hearing wasn't the sound of a faulty engine. It was the sound of the foundation starting to give way. The hum was the sound of the world I had built for myself starting to crack. I had been so busy being a good sister, a good daughter, a good soldier, that I had forgotten to be a person. I had forgotten what it was to want something for myself. I had forgotten what it was like to feel seen. The incident with Rowan, the public spectacle, had been a slap in the face. It had woken me up to the reality of my situation. I wasn't just overlooked, I was being actively sidelined. I was a problem to be managed, an asset to be used. They were using my good nature, my sense of duty, against me. And the worst part was, I had let them. I had never questioned their motives. I had never looked for the cracks. I had just kept going, kept working, kept believing that one day they would see me for who I really was. But they never would. Because they never saw me. They saw an extension of themselves. A tool to be used, a resource to be managed. And I was tired of being managed. I was tired of being a tool. I was tired of the hum. I was tired of the calm on the surface, knowing what was underneath. I was tired of the bridge. The hum had a different meaning now. It was no longer a warning. It was a siren. A siren calling me to something else. Something better. Something that was all mine. The hum was a crack. And I was ready to fall through. Until that night. The drive home from the gala was a silent, suffocating thing. My brother, Adrian, was at the wheel of his luxury SUV, the hum of its powerful engine a low thrum against the backdrop of the Washington, D.C. night. Streetlights in Alexandria flashed by, casting a cold, intermittent flicker across his face. My mother, Evelyn, sat in the back, her silence a more potent weapon than any shout could ever be. She had been a master of it my whole life, using a quiet disapproval to reshape the very air in a room. I sat in the passenger seat, my uniform feeling like a cage. My heart was a mortar cadence, a heavy, steady beat against my ribs. My throat felt dry, like I'd been breathing dust for a week, and my hands were cold, despite the car's climate control. I kept my gaze forward, my posture rigid. I was on safety. My silence, the same one that had served me so well in the Grand Hall, was now an active irritant. They were used to my quiet, but this was different. This was a silence that held a challenge, a silence that wouldn't break. Adrian finally spoke, his voice clipped, his words like small, sharp stones. That was a spectacle, Mara. He didn't look at me. He looked at the road, but his eyes in the rearview mirror found my mother's. A silent, shared communication. A confirmation. My mother's voice, when it came, was a study in practiced grace. It was gentle, almost disappointed. We were with General Sinclair, Mara. What were you thinking, drawing that kind of attention? I didn't answer. They didn't need an answer. This wasn't a conversation. It was a condemnation. You know, there's internal chatter about reopening your pogrom and FB Lima reports, Adrian said, a new edge in his voice. This wasn't a casual comment. It was a threat, a strategic reveal meant to hit home. The hum of the SUV's engine seemed to grow louder, more menacing. It wasn't a hum of warning anymore. It was the sound of public shame. They were trying to label me a liability, to turn my medical record against me. My mind, trained for combat and crisis, began to map the terrain. Bagram and Lima. The places where I had truly been myself. The places where I had been a commander, not a nurse. The places where I had saved lives. They were using my service against me, twisting my actions into a narrative of insubordination. They wanted to make me small. They wanted to shrink my accomplishments until they fit neatly into the box they had built for me. And they were going to use my own record to do it. I looked out the window. We were at a red light now, on the corner of King Street in Alexandria. The car was a perfectly lit, white-glove interrogation room. Outside, through the glass, I could see two young cadets, probably first years from Georgetown, laughing as they walked down the sidewalk, their civilian clothes a stark contrast to my uniform. They were young and free, their laughter a sound I hadn't heard in years. Inside the car, the air was thick with hostility. My mother's disapproval, Adrian's quiet rage. I was a target, and they were trying to lock me down. I stayed radio silent. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. There was no point. They weren't looking for a truth. They were looking for a surrender. My body was still, but my mind was a storm. I thought about the first time I went to Lima. The dust, the heat, the constant roar of the choppers. The smell of diesel and sweat and antiseptic. It was the place where I had felt most alive. And now, Adrian wanted to take that away from me. He wanted to twist it until it was unrecognizable. The thought was a physical blow. A cold dread settled in my stomach, a familiar feeling from my days in the field, the one that came just before a crisis. But I had been trained for this. I had been taught to stay calm under fire, to keep a clear head, to not let my emotions get the better of me. They had expected me to fold, but I wouldn't. The hum of the engine, the flicker of the streetlights, the sound of my family's disdain, it was all just noise. And I had learned to tune out the noise. I was a soldier, and I would fight this war on my own terms. I would not give them the satisfaction of a verbal defeat. I would not allow them to drag me down into their world of whispers and innuendo. The only thing I had to lose was my reputation, and that was something I had built on my own. My work, my discipline, my quiet service, it was all a record of who I was. And they couldn't erase that with a few well-placed rumors. They could try, but they would fail. The hum of the SUV's engine was no longer a threat. It was the sound of a countdown. They had just given me a new mission, and I was ready to execute. I just had to wait for the right time. The red light turned green. Adrian put his foot on the gas. We pulled away from the laughing cadets, from the world outside, and into the silent darkness of the night. The car was a bubble of resentment, a space where I was a prisoner of my own family. But even in a prison, there is always a way to escape. And I was starting to see the cracks in their fortress. I would use those cracks. I would use their silence against them. I would use their arrogance against them. I would use everything I had learned in the field to win this war. And I would do it quietly. I would do it with grace. I would do it with discipline. And they wouldn't even see it coming. The car had been a white-glove interrogation room. But now, my apartment off Fort Barrington was a silent, empty tomb. I walked in, shutting the uniform that had felt so constricting. The hum of the HVAC system was all that filled the air, a low, constant sound I usually found soothing. Tonight, it felt different. It was the sound of a waiting room, a blank space before a verdict was delivered. It was the hum of discernment, a sound I was finally beginning to understand. I didn't turn on a light. I let the faint blue glow from the streetlights outside bleed through the windows. The air was cool, the Virginia night a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the car. I stood for a moment, simply breathing, letting the silence wrap around me. It was a weighted silence, heavier than any noise. A silence that felt like the moment before a detonation, a silence that held the full, unadulterated weight of what had just transpired. I wasn't just a person who had been insulted. I was a target. And they had fired the first shot. My mind, still operating in tactical mode, went to the laptop on my small desk. The screen flickered to life, its light the only thing in the room besides the ambient glow. I navigated to a few key news sites, then to a couple of military forums, a habit from my years in intel. The first signs were subtle. A few anonymous quotes in a clickbait article about controversial medical procedures in the field. The title didn't mention my name, but the details were too specific. They talked about my time at FB Lima, twisting my decisions to save lives into a narrative of insubordination. They said I had overstepped my authority, that I had risked the mission for a patient. My heart did not pound. My breathing did not quicken. My body was on standby. I went deeper. I started auditing access logs, a task I hadn't done in years. I had given Adrian access to my records back when he was helping me with a professional bio for a conference. I saw his digital fingerprints everywhere, on a document here, an old email there. I didn't have to guess at the motive. It was all there, laid out in the data. I mapped the connections. Adrian's firm, a think tank he consulted for, a lobbying group pushing for military budget cuts. The trail was cold and methodical. A push to curtail frontline medical integration, coded as cross-functional ambiguity, a threat to the established order. They were trying to get rid of my pilot program, and I was just collateral damage. The hum of my heater was a low, constant frequency. I no longer heard it as a sound of comfort. It was a series of encrypted comms, a secret language only I could decipher, a language of betrayal. I felt it then. The true collapse of trust. It wasn't a sudden crash, it was a slow, silent implosion. It was the realization that the people who were supposed to be my family were my greatest adversaries. They didn't just disagree with me. They were actively working to sabotage me, to erase my name. They had repurposed my silence. They had misread my discipline. They had mistaken my loyalty for weakness. The silence in the room was a character in itself. It was the space where my belief in family had once lived, and now it was gone. It was a space so vast, so empty, that it took my breath away. It was a new kind of silence, a vacuum of loss. The personal loss wasn't just a job or a program. It was the loss of a life I thought I had, a life where I was a part of a unit. The loss of a past I thought I understood. I picked up the ribbons I had placed on my desk earlier. They were flat, silent, no longer a source of pride, but a reminder of a system I had believed in, a system that my own brother was now using against me. My badges were at rest, but my will was on standby. The silence had a name now. It was called betrayal. Have you ever stood inside this kind of silence, where trust collapses? If you have, you already know what I felt. The silence was a mirror. I saw myself clearly in it. I saw a soldier who had been complacent, who had mistaken peace for security. I had been so busy being a good daughter, a good sister, that I had forgotten to be a good strategist. I had given them my trust without a second thought, and they had used it to build a wall against me. But even a wall has a foundation. And I knew how to find the cracks. I would not yell. I would not leak to the press. I would not seek public sympathy. That was their game. My game was different. It was a game of facts, of procedure, of truth. I opened a new document and began to type. No dramatic confession. No angry rant. Just a simple, clear statement of fact. I was filing under 10 U.S.C. Section 1034, the Military Whistleblower Protection Act. I would not fight them with noise. I would fight them with paper. I would fight them with the very system they thought they could manipulate. I would not stand on a podium and declare my innocence. I would let the evidence speak for me. My vow was simple. I would rise again, not in a blaze of glory, but with the quiet dignity of a soldier who knows her duty. I would win this war, not for vengeance, but for justice. My silence had been mistaken for subordination. I would show them what it was. It was a lawful order. My life became a silent strategy. The days were long, filled with the quiet work of a soldier preparing for a different kind of war. I logged into government databases, my keystrokes a quiet, relentless rhythm. I didn't need to hack anything. My clearance gave me access to public-facing documents, to archived emails, to the very paper trail they thought they had erased. I was simply piecing together the timeline, the logistics of the betrayal. I was looking for the spark of truth, the one tiny inconsistency that would unravel it all. My brother, Adrian, with his brittle charm, was a master of misdirection. He was a performance. I had known that for years. But I had never seen the full extent of the stagecraft until now. He would post on social media a picture of him shaking a senator's hand, a quote about professionalism and integrity. The facade was perfect. But I knew the cracks were there. I knew the hum was getting louder. The flicker of the streetlights in his luxury SUV had been a warning. The flicker was now a constant, an irritating strobe I couldn't ignore. The first break came not from a government database, but from an unexpected source. I received a secure email, the subject line a single, cryptic word, Lima. It was from Layla Hartcole, Adrian's ex-wife. She was a woman of quiet, disciplined intelligence, an architect who understood that a single crack in a foundation could bring down a building. Her divorce from Adrian had been messy, a long, drawn-out battle. Her email was simple. It contained a single, redacted page from her divorce filing, the result of a discovery motion. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was a single line from an email Adrian had sent to a colleague. Discredit Mara at the symposium, kill the pilot program at Walter Reed. It was a face reveal slip by the betrayer, a momentary loss of his rehearsed grace. I didn't reply to Layla. I didn't need to. Her purpose was served. My strategy was already in motion. I compiled, I redacted, I verified. The evidence was all there, laid out in a timeline so simple, so irrefutable, that it could have been a training manual. I wasn't just collecting evidence, I was building a case. A case that would speak for itself. I took a cab to the Pentagon, the concrete monument to American power. I walked through the corridors, the fluorescent lights humming over me, and I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I didn't have to say a word. I just had to deliver the paper. I hand-delivered the dossier to the DoD Inspector General's office. I didn't ask for a meeting. I didn't try to explain myself. I simply handed the envelope to the officer at the desk and said, "This is a whistleblower report." My hands were steady. My voice was calm. The officer looked at me, then at the envelope, and nodded. That was it. No fanfare. No drama. Just procedure. It was a new kind of silence, a powerful silence, the silence of a system working as it was designed to. In parallel, I accepted General Sinclair's invitation to a briefing at Walter Reed. It was a medical symposium, a low-key event meant to showcase new technologies and procedures. Adrian was there, of course, a guest speaker. He was talking about cost-effective medical deployment, a euphemism for the budget cuts he was pushing for. He saw me and gave a cold, practiced smile, a rehearsed grace that was no longer convincing. He thought he had won. He had no idea what was coming. The room was filled with military doctors, nurses, and medical personnel. They were a different breed from the contractors and consultants at the gala. They were the ones who had seen the real cost of war. They were the ones who understood that a soldier's life was not a line item on a budget. During the Q&A, a woman stood up. I recognized her instantly. It was Lieutenant Commander Elena Park, our former surgical lead from Lima. She was an unexpected ally, an unscripted moment in a choreographed performance. She had a warm strength, a warm steel that was immediately disarming. She spoke with a quiet authority that cut through the noise. "Commander Cole," she said, looking directly at Adrian. "Your report on the Lima incident is a gross misrepresentation of the facts. Under ward that night, when Mara saved those lives, no one died. Not a single one." The room was silent. Adrian's face, for the first time, showed a crack. His brittle charm shattered. The confidence was gone. He was just a man. A frightened man. And then General Sinclair stood up. He wasn't a man of words. He was a man of action. He looked at the board, then at Adrian, and his voice, which had commanded battlefields, was now a thunderclap in a quiet room. "If integrity makes you uncomfortable, you're not protecting the uniform, you're burying it." He then turned to me. "I'm formally requesting to reopen Colonel Quinn's record on its merits." It was over. Adrian's power was gone. He had thought he was fighting a personal war, but he had just started a war against the system itself. And the system was winning. The days that followed were not about victory laps or public vindication. They were about strategic withdrawal. I changed all my passwords. I revoked all the informal data access I had ever given out. I cut off contact with Adrian and my mother, not with anger, but with the quiet finality of an area denial operation. My phone became a tool for work and chosen communication only. The flicker of their calls and texts, the constant attempts to re-engage, no longer registered as a warning. It was just noise. And I had learned to tune out the noise. My recovery was not a sudden event. It was a disciplined, day-by-day practice. My apartment felt different now. The hum of the heater was no longer a silent comm system. It was just the sound of a warm, safe home. I started new routines, small disciplines that built a new foundation. I went for a run every morning at dawn, the cool air of a DC autumn, a clean, sharp shock to my system. The city was just waking up. The streetlights flickered off, and the rising sun, a quiet, determined force, washed over the monuments. My posture squared. My gaze was no longer inward, but terrain dominant, a military term for surveying the landscape with a calm, assured focus. I was stationed at Walter Reed, working on the pilot program that was now fully funded. It was a new kind of team. I stood beside, not ahead. I gave directives, but I also listened. I was not there to lead, but to facilitate. I was a witness who created space. A young lieutenant named Jada Brooks, who had a left-hand prosthetic from an IED blast, was the kind of soldier I had fought for. She was smart, resilient, and had a warmth to her that was contagious. She watched me for a few days, then one afternoon, she said something that stayed with me. "You know, Colonel, you don't guide. You follow. You get out of our way. That's why we move." Her words were a validation of everything I had learned. Leadership wasn't about being in front. It was about creating a path for others to follow. I also reconnected with General Sinclair. He wasn't a man to waste words. He didn't apologize for his son's past. He didn't offer me a promotion. He just came to a briefing and listened. He saw the work we were doing, the lives we were changing. And one day, he simply said, "Mara, you earned your place at this table." The media attention was a nuisance. They wanted a story. They wanted a victim. They wanted a hero. I gave them none of it. I released a brief, measured, public letter. It wasn't a press release. It was a final statement. I am neither a hero nor a victim. I acted because help was needed and I was present. Silence in the face of harm is complicity. That was all. It was an after-action report, a final word on a closed case. The hum of public opinion, the noise of their speculation, died down. The flicker of their interest moved on to a new story. The hum now belonged to me. It was the sound of a system working, the sound of quiet justice, a sound of peace. I found a new kind of family. It wasn't built on blood or obligation, but on shared purpose and mutual respect. The quiet moments in the Walter Reed Rehab Center, the conversations with other soldiers, the shared experience of healing, that was my new unit. It was a new kind of hum, a low, steady sound of quiet strength. A sound that was a lot like me. There was still one last chapter to close. The natural consequences for Adrian and his associates were not a public spectacle. There was no gavel, no news conference. The verdict was delivered with the quiet efficiency of a system that, when prompted, corrects itself. His contracts were frozen. His access to military institutions was revoked. He wasn't jailed or shamed in a courtroom. His career simply ceased. He became a man without a purpose, a consultant without clients, a voice without an audience. There was no gloating. There was just gravity. The world he had built on brittle charm and rehearsed grace simply fell away. My new life wasn't about vengeance. It was about peace. I found a rhythm in the quiet, a deep satisfaction in the everyday. I moved out of the government apartment and into a small row house in Alexandria, Virginia. The house was old, with a small garden I was slowly bringing back to life. I spent my mornings with the soldiers at Walter Reed, working on the pilot program, and my evenings in the garden with the smell of damp earth and late-blooming flowers. The closing came in a place that would have felt alien to the old me. It was a community garden at Walter Reed, a space with strings of paper lanterns and the scent of freshly cut grass. It was a small, quiet celebration for the success of our program. There was music, but it wasn't the manicured chamber strings of the gala. It was the simple, joyful sound of a folk guitar. There were no cameras, no press, no grand announcements. There were just people, soldiers with canes, with braces, with prosthetic limbs, each step a victory. It was a community dance where every inch counted as ground gained. General Sinclair was there. And Rowan. He wasn't stiff or withdrawn. He was laughing, talking to Jada, whose prosthetic glinted in the twilight. When I was asked to say a few words, I kept it simple. I didn't talk about betrayal. I didn't talk about Adrian. I didn't talk about victory. I talked about our work. I talked about our mission. And then I looked out at the faces and I said, I don't raise my voice to be loud. I raise it to be clear. Rowan stepped forward. He wasn't asked to speak, but he did anyway. His voice was steady, a deep resonance of a man who had found his footing. He looked at me, then at the crowd, and said, "She didn't lead. She followed. That's why we moved. It was a verdict that didn't need a courtroom. It was a final, quiet liberation. I have learned that there is a silence that surrenders and a silence that commands. For a long time, I was the first. I surrendered my voice. I surrendered my power. But now I choose the latter. I choose the silence that commands. It is the silence of a woman who knows her worth. The quiet strength of a woman who has found her peace. The low, steady hum of a woman who has found her way back to herself. Have you found your way back from betrayal? If you've ever walked through something like this, tell me your story in the comments. I read them all, and someone out there needs to hear what you've survived. And if you want more stories that remind you you're not alone, stay here with me for the next one.